The weight of Alexander's head against Jeremy's shoulder had become everything. The movie credits rolled across the television screen, casting shifting shadows through the darkened living room, but neither of them moved. Jeremy could feel the steady rhythm of Alexander's breathing, could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, something expensive and woodsy that Jeremy had memorized without meaning to, could sense the exact moment when Alexander realized the movie had ended and yet chose to stay exactly where he was. This was the moment Jeremy had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. 2 years and 7 months of friendship, of movie nights and shared dinners, of listening to Alexander talk about his string of disappointing girlfriends while Jeremy's heart twisted like a knife in his chest. 2 years and 7 months of pretending to be just a friend while dying a little more each day from the weight of unspoken love. But now Alexander wasn't moving away. The credits finished, the screen went black, and still Alexander remained pressed against Jeremy's side, his dark hair tickling Jeremy's neck, his hand resting dangerously close to Jeremy's thigh on the couch cushion between them. Jeremy's heart hammered so loudly he was certain Alexander could hear it. He wondered if this was what drowning felt like, this desperate need for air combined with the absolute terror of breaking the surface. Because breaking this moment, acknowledging what was happening between them, felt like crossing a bridge that neither of them was ready to cross. Alexander shifted slightly, not pulling away but settling deeper into Jeremy's side, and Jeremy felt his world tilt on its axis. This wasn't accidental anymore. This was a choice. This was Alexander, who had spent the entire evening making subtle comments about the romantic leads, who had insisted they sit closer together because the couch was, quote, zero, who had been stealing glances at Jeremy throughout the movie when he thought Jeremy wasn't looking. Before we see how this story ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends found themselves balanced on the precipice of something that could change everything, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Jeremy had been living in what he now recognized as a state of beautiful torture. He had perfected the art of being Alexander's best friend, of listening with careful attention as Alexander complained about his latest relationship troubles, of offering advice that he knew was sound even as it felt like swallowing glass. He had become an expert at hiding his true feelings behind supportive smiles and carefully neutral responses. That particular evening in October, Alexander had arrived at Jeremy's apartment with takeout Chinese food and an expression that Jeremy had learned to recognize. It was the look Alexander got when his girlfriend had done something that left him feeling empty and confused, though Alexander never seemed able to articulate exactly what that something was. His shoulders would slump in a particular way, his usual animated energy would drain from his features, and he would get that distant look in his eyes that suggested he was questioning everything about his life. They had settled onto Jeremy's couch, the same couch where they would later share that earth-shifting moment, and Alexander had picked at his lo mein with unusual listlessness. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but charged with unspoken tension. Jeremy, ever the supportive friend, had asked, "What happened this time?" Alexander had set down his chopsticks and run his hands through his dark hair, a gesture that never failed to make Jeremy's stomach flutter with unwanted desire. Quote, Alexander had said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. Quote, where Jeremy had felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar mixture of jealousy and protective concern. Quote, Alexander had replied, and there had been something in his voice that Jeremy couldn't quite identify, a note of desperation, of confusion, of someone grasping for something that remained perpetually out of reach. We've been together for 8 months. She's beautiful. She's smart. She has her life together. On paper, it makes perfect sense. But, Jeremy had prompted, recognizing the unfinished thought hanging in the air between them. But when she said it, when she talked about picking out furniture together and sharing a bathroom and falling asleep next to each other every night, I felt nothing, less than nothing. I felt trapped. Alexander had looked up at Jeremy then, his brown eyes holding a confusion that seemed to go deeper than simple relationship uncertainty. Is that normal, Jeremy? To feel trapped when someone you're supposed to care about wants to build a life with you? Jeremy had swallowed hard, fighting the urge to say what he really thought, which was that Alexander felt trapped because he was trying to force himself into a life that didn't fit. Instead, he had offered the careful, measured response of a good friend. But Alexander had shaken his head vigorously. The words had hit Jeremy like a physical blow because he understood exactly what Alexander meant. Jeremy had been pretending for years, pretending that friendship was enough, pretending that watching Alexander cycle through relationship after relationship didn't tear him apart piece by piece. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here they both were, pretending to be people they weren't, sitting inches apart on a couch and yet feeling completely isolated in their respective deceptions. That night, after Alexander had gone home to his girlfriend and his perfectly reasonable life, Jeremy had lain awake staring at the ceiling and wondering what would happen if they both stopped pretending. The thought had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. What if Alexander's dissatisfaction with his relationships wasn't about the women themselves, but about the fact that he was looking for something else entirely? What if Jeremy's careful friendship was actually enabling Alexander's confusion rather than helping him? The next few weeks had passed in a strange sort of limbo. Alexander had broken up with his girlfriend, citing the need for space and time to figure himself out. The conversation, as Alexander had described it to Jeremy, had been painful but necessary. She cried, Alexander had told Jeremy over coffee the day after the breakup. She said she could feel me pulling away for months, that she felt like she was dating a ghost. And the worst part is, she was right. I was a ghost. I've been a ghost in every relationship I've ever had. Jeremy had tried to be supportive while battling the guilty relief that flooded through him every time Alexander mentioned being single again. Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet, he had offered weakly. Maybe, Alexander had said, but his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect the problem went deeper than simply finding the right woman. It was during this period that their friendship had begun to shift in ways that Jeremy noticed but didn't dare acknowledge. Alexander started spending more time at Jeremy's apartment, often showing up unannounced with dinner or a bottle of wine, claiming he didn't want to be alone in his own place. They had always been physically comfortable with each other, but now their casual touches seemed to linger longer, carry more weight. Jeremy found himself cataloging these moments like precious artifacts. The way Alexander would curl up on the opposite end of the couch during their movie nights, his feet tucked under Jeremy's thigh. The way Alexander would lean against Jeremy's shoulder when they looked at something on Jeremy's phone, his breath warm against Jeremy's neck. The way Alexander would hug him goodbye at the end of each evening, holding on just a beat longer than necessary, his hands pressing against Jeremy's back as if he was reluctant to let go. Each touch felt like a question that Jeremy didn't know how to answer. The shift had accelerated one evening in late November. They had been cooking dinner together, something that had become a regular occurrence, when Alexander had suddenly stopped stirring the pasta sauce and turned to Jeremy with an expression of intense curiosity. Quote 16. Alexander had said, his voice carrying a weight that made Jeremy's pulse quicken. Can I ask you something kind of personal? Jeremy had felt his pulse quicken, but he had nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. Have you ever kissed a guy? The question had come out of nowhere, delivered in the same casual tone Alexander might have used to ask about the weather. Jeremy had nearly dropped the wooden spoon he was holding, his mind racing through a dozen possible responses and their potential consequences. What? Jeremy had managed to say, buying himself time to think. I mean, I know you've dated women, Alexander had continued, seemingly oblivious to Jeremy's shock. Quote 21. Jeremy had felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could expose everything he had been trying so hard to hide. But there had been something in Alexander's eyes, a genuine curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like hope, that made Jeremy decide to take a calculated risk. Yes, Jeremy had said quietly, his heart hammering against his ribs. I have. Alexander had gone very still, his hand frozen on the wooden spoon. And I realize that I'm attracted to both, Jeremy had said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite the terror coursing through his veins. Men and women. It took me a while to understand that about myself. Alexander had nodded slowly as if Jeremy's words were confirming something he had already suspected. Quote 27. Alexander had said softly. Quote 28. They had finished cooking in a charged silence. both of them seeming to understand that something fundamental had shifted between them. Jeremy had spent the rest of the evening hyper-aware of every glance, every accidental touch, every moment when Alexander seemed to be studying his face with new interest. That night, after Alexander had left, Jeremy had allowed himself to hope for the first time in over 2 years. It was a dangerous hope, the kind that could destroy him if he was wrong, but he couldn't seem to stop it from growing. The hope had been fed by a series of increasingly intimate conversations over the following weeks. Alexander had started asking questions about love, about connection, about what it meant to feel truly understood by another person. He had talked about feeling like he had been searching for something his entire life without knowing what it was. "I feel like I've been sleepwalking," Alexander had said one evening as they sat on Jeremy's balcony, sharing a bottle of wine, the city lights twinkling below them. Quote 30. Quote 30, and Jeremy had asked, though he was terrified of the answer. Alexander had looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. Quote 30. Alexander had said softly. The conversation that had changed everything had happened on a cold December evening. Just 2 weeks before that pivotal movie night, Alexander had shown up at Jeremy's apartment looking shaken, his usual confidence replaced by something raw and vulnerable. His hair was disheveled from the wind, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and there was a wildness in his eyes that Jeremy had never seen before. Jeremy had immediately known something was wrong. What happened? "I ran into Sarah today," Alexander had said, referring to his ex-girlfriend. "She wanted to talk about why things didn't work between us." Jeremy had felt his stomach clench with familiar jealousy, but he had forced himself to ask, "What did she say?" "She said she always felt like I was comparing her to someone else," Alexander had said, sinking onto Jeremy's couch with the weight of someone carrying a heavy burden. To 38. Alexander had looked up at Jeremy with eyes that seemed to hold a new understanding, a dawning realization that was both terrifying and liberating. Quote 39. Jeremy's mouth had gone dry, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Alexander could hear it. "Who?" Alexander had held his gaze for a long moment before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "You," Alexander had said simply. "I've been comparing them all to you." The words had hit Jeremy like lightning, illuminating everything in stark, brilliant clarity. He had stared at Alexander, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for Alexander to take it back or explain it away. "I know how that sounds," Alexander had continued quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain. "I know it doesn't make sense. You're my best friend. You're a guy. I've never thought of myself as a gay or even bi. But Jeremy, when Sarah said that, when she pointed out that I was always holding back part of myself, I realized that the part I was holding back was the part that belongs to you." Jeremy had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, his chest tight with emotion. "Alexander, I don't know what this means," Alexander had said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to make sense of it. All I know is that every relationship I've tried to build has felt like settling for less than what I have with you. Every woman I've kissed has left me wondering why it doesn't feel the way it feels when you hug me goodbye. Every time I've tried to imagine a future with someone else, I end up imagining it with you instead." The confession had hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Jeremy had wanted to respond, wanted to tell Alexander that he had been in love with him for over 2 years, but the words had stuck in his throat, paralyzed by the magnitude of what was happening. Instead, he had reached out and taken Alexander's hand, threading their fingers together in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. Alexander's hand had been warm and slightly trembling, and Jeremy had marveled at the simple miracle of being allowed to touch him this way. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," Jeremy had said softly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on Alexander's knuckles. To 49. Alexander had squeezed his hand, relief flooding his features like sunrise breaking over a landscape. "I had 50 about a quote tune," Jeremy had whispered. "Quote behind enough." They had spent the rest of that evening talking about everything and nothing, their hands remaining intertwined on the couch between them. When Alexander had finally left, he had hugged Jeremy goodbye as he always did, but this time the embrace had lasted long enough for Jeremy to feel Alexander's heartbeat against his chest, fast and uncertain and hopeful. The 2 weeks that followed had been a careful dance of increasing intimacy. Alexander had started texting Jeremy good morning and good night, messages that felt different from their usual and casual communication. Simple things like, hope you have a good day and sleep well, carried new weight, new meaning, new promise. He had begun finding excuses to touch Jeremy during their conversations. A hand on his shoulder when making a point, fingers brushing as they passed each other in the kitchen, lingering hugs that spoke of barely contained longing. Jeremy had reciprocated carefully, testing the boundaries of this new dynamic between them. He had allowed himself to return Alexander's touches, to let his gaze linger on Alexander's face, to speak more openly about his feelings and thoughts. Each day had brought them incrementally closer to something that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. The night of the movie had been Alexander's idea. He had suggested they watch something together, just the two of them, and Jeremy had agreed despite the nervous energy that had been building between them all week. They had chosen a romantic comedy, something light and easy, though Jeremy had barely paid attention to the plot. Instead, he had found himself hyper-aware of Alexander's presence beside him on the couch. They had started the evening sitting at opposite ends, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, they had moved closer together. First, Alexander had shifted to the middle cushion during a particularly funny scene, claiming he wanted to see Jeremy's reaction. Then Jeremy had done the same during an emotional moment, until they were sitting close enough that Jeremy could feel the warmth radiating from Alexander's body. Halfway through the movie, during a particularly cheesy romantic scene where the male lead declared his love in the rain, Alexander had made a joke about the unrealistic expectations set by Hollywood romance. Real love isn't like that, he had said with a laugh. Real love is quieter, more comfortable. Jeremy had laughed, and in that moment of shared amusement, Alexander had leaned against Jeremy's shoulder. It had started as a casual gesture, the kind of thing that might happen between any two close friends sharing a moment of humor. But as the minutes passed and Alexander didn't move away, Jeremy had felt the gesture transform into something more significant. Alexander had settled more fully against Jeremy's side, his head finding the perfect spot in the curve of Jeremy's neck and shoulder, his body relaxing in a way that spoke of trust and comfort and something deeper. Jeremy had barely breathed for the rest of the movie, afraid that any movement might break the spell. He had felt every rise and fall of Alexander's chest, had been intoxicated by the scent of Alexander's hair, had fought the overwhelming urge to wrap his arms around the man he had loved for so long. The movie had continued playing, but Jeremy's entire world had narrowed to the weight of Alexander against his side, the warmth of his body, the soft sound of his breathing. When the credits had begun to roll, Jeremy had expected Alexander to pull away, to return to his own side of the couch with some casual comment about the movie. Instead, Alexander had gone very still, as if he too was afraid to break the moment. The silence had stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Jeremy had felt Alexander's breathing change, becoming more deliberate, more conscious. He had sensed the exact moment when Alexander realized what was happening between them and chose not to retreat. That was when Jeremy had understood that this was no longer about accidental touches or casual intimacy. This was Alexander making a choice, crossing a line that they had been approaching for months without acknowledging it. Now, sitting in the darkness with Alexander's weight warm and solid against his side, Jeremy felt as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, one misread signal, and he could lose not only the possibility of something more with Alexander, but their friendship as well. But Alexander still wasn't moving away. If anything, he seemed to be settling deeper into Jeremy's side, his breathing evening out as if he was exactly where he belonged. Jeremy gathered his courage and allowed his hand to come to rest on Alexander's arm, a gentle touch that could be interpreted as either friendly comfort or something more intimate. Alexander's response was immediate and unmistakable. He leaned further into Jeremy's touch, his own hand moving to rest on Jeremy's thigh. The contact sent electricity shooting through Jeremy's entire body. This was happening after 2 years and 7 months of hiding his feelings, of pretending to be satisfied with friendship, of watching Alexander struggle through relationships that never seemed to fit. This was actually happening. Jeremy, Alexander said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah? The movie ended. I know. I'm not moving. Jeremy felt his heart stop and restart. I noticed. Is that okay? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with years of unspoken longing and the terrifying possibility of change. Jeremy knew that his answer would determine everything that happened next, would either open a door that neither of them could close or slam it shut forever. More than okay, Jeremy whispered. Alexander lifted his head then, turning to look at Jeremy in the dim light from the television screen. His face was closer than it had ever been, close enough that Jeremy could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count his eyelashes, could feel his breath against his skin. Jeremy, Alexander said again. And this time Jeremy's name sounded different in his mouth, weighted with new meaning. Quote 66, Jeremy asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. I'm thinking that I've been an idiot, Alexander said, his gaze dropping to Jeremy's lips for just a moment before returning to his eyes. Quote 68, Jeremy felt tears threaten at the corners of his eyes. Quote 69, quote, when Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Quote Shannon, the confession hit Jeremy like a wave, washing away years of doubt and fear and desperate hope. He reached up with trembling fingers to cup Alexander's face, his thumb brushing across Alexander's cheekbone with infinite tenderness. Quote 72, Alexander whispered, quote, 73, quote, Jeremy said without hesitation, quote to 75. Alexander's eyes widened in shock and something that looked like pain. That long? That long? God, Jeremy, I'm so sorry. I put you through hell, didn't I? Talking about other people, asking for advice about relationships when you... Jeremy shook his head, cutting off Alexander's apology with gentle fingers pressed to his lips. Alexander said, his voice muffled against Jeremy's fingers. You knew about yourself, about your feelings, and you never said anything. What was I supposed to say? Jeremy asked gently, lowering his hand but keeping it cupped against Alexander's cheek. Water 83, quote 80. Alexander said urgently, his hands coming up to cover Jeremy's. I can return them. Jeremy, I think I've been in love with you for longer than I realized. I think that's what all of this has been about. Jeremy felt his world shift completely, everything he had believed about his situation rearranging itself into a new configuration. You love me? I love you, Alexander said, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised Jeremy. I love your kindness and your patience and the way you listen to me ramble about things that don't matter. I love how safe I feel with you, how much like myself I can be when we're together. I love that you see me, really see me, in a way that no one else ever has. Jeremy was crying now, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude streaming down his face. I love you too, he whispered. I love you so much that it physically hurts sometimes, watching you try to build a life with people who didn't understand you the way I do. Alexander leaned forward then, resting his forehead against Jeremy's, their faces so close that they were breathing the same air. Alexander asked. Jeremy smiled through his tears. Alexander asked, his voice soft and uncertain and full of wonder. Jeremy's answer was to close the distance between them, pressing his lips to Alexander's in a kiss that felt like coming home and starting an adventure all at once. Alexander responded immediately, his hand coming up to tangle in Jeremy's hair as he kissed him back with years of suppressed longing. The kiss was everything Jeremy had imagined and nothing like he had expected. It was soft and desperate and perfect, tasting of the wine they had shared earlier and something that was uniquely Alexander. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jeremy felt as though he had been holding his breath for 2 years and 7 months and was finally able to breathe again. Wow, Alexander whispered, his lips still close enough to brush against Jeremy's as he spoke. Quote 95. Jeremy agreed. Quote 96. They sat in the darkness for a long moment, foreheads still pressed together, processing the magnitude of what had just happened between them. Quote 7. Alexander admitted quietly. Quote 9, and Jeremy said, quote 1, quote 100, Alexander said after a moment of consideration. Quote 1, quote 1, Jeremy said. Quote 1, Alexander pulled back enough to look into Jeremy's eyes. What if I'm bad at this? What if I don't know how to be with a pinin? What if I disappoint you? Jeremy smiled, reaching up to trace the line of Alexander's jaw with gentle fingers. Quote 1, quote 1, Alexander said. Quote 107, quote 108, Jeremy agreed. Quote 109. Alexander considered this, then nodded slowly. Quote 110. They kissed again, longer this time, with less desperation and more exploration. Jeremy marveled at the way Alexander tasted, at the soft sound he made when Jeremy's tongue traced his lower lip, at the way Alexander's hands seemed to know exactly where to touch him. When they broke apart this time, Alexander was smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. Alexander said, quote 112 and quote 113, Jeremy said. Quote 114 and quote 115 and quote 116. Alexander said, his voice full of wonder. Quote 117. They spent the next hour talking, really talking, about everything they had been too afraid to say before. Alexander told Jeremy about the growing dissatisfaction he had felt in every relationship, about the way he had found himself comparing every woman he dated to Jeremy without understanding why. He talked about the nights he had lain awake next to girlfriends, feeling lonelier than when he was actually alone. Alexander confessed, his fingers tracing patterns on Jeremy's palm. Every relationship felt like I was acting in a play, reading lines that didn't feel like my own. I thought maybe I was just broken somehow, incapable of the kind of love other people seem to find so easily. Jeremy told Alexander about the careful way he had hidden his feelings, about the nights he had lain awake, wondering what would happen if he was brave enough to tell the truth. He talked about the guilt he felt for being secretly relieved every time Alexander's relationships ended, about the way he had coached himself to be supportive while his heart was breaking. Quote 120, Jeremy said softly. Quote 121. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their complete lack of experience with this kind of relationship transition. Alexander worried about what his family would think, about how to navigate coming out later in life, about whether he would be good enough for Jeremy after years of failed heterosexual relationships. Quote 123, Alexander said with a nervous laugh. Quote 23. Jeremy worried about moving too fast, about whether Alexander might panic and retreat, about the possibility that this was just experimentation that would end with Alexander deciding he was straight after all. Quote 1, Jeremy asked quietly. Quote 25. But beneath all their fears was a foundation of love and trust that had been building for over 2 years. They knew each other, understood each other, cared for each other in ways that transcended gender or sexual orientation. This wasn't starting from scratch. This was finally acknowledging what had been growing between them all along. As the night wore on, they found themselves lying on the couch together, Alexander's head on Jeremy's chest, their legs tangled together in a way that felt both new and completely natural. Jeremy ran his fingers through Alexander's hair, marveling at the fact that he was finally allowed to touch him this way. Good to Arden, Alexander asked quietly, his breath warm against Jeremy's chest. Tomorrow we wake up and we're still us, Jeremy said. Still the same people who care about each other, still the same people who make each other laugh, still the same people who can talk for hours about nothing and everything. But also different, Alexander said. Also different, Jeremy agreed, but different in a good way. Different in the way we should have been all along. Alexander lifted his head to look at Jeremy. I want to try this, he said seriously. I want to try being with you. Really being with you. I'm scared and I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to try though. Jeremy felt his heart swell with so much love he thought it might burst. I want to try too, he said. We can take it slow, figure it out as we go. How slow? Alexander asked with a smile that was part shy, part mischievous. As slow as you need, Jeremy said. We have time. We have all the time in the world. Alexander kissed him again, soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you, he whispered against Jeremy's lips. Quote 140. Jeremy whispered back, and the words felt like a prayer, like a blessing, like the beginning of everything. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other on Jeremy's couch, the television casting shifting shadows across their peaceful faces. When Jeremy woke in the early hours of the morning, Alexander was still in his arms, still choosing to stay close even in sleep. Jeremy watched the sunrise through his living room window, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, and thought about new beginnings, about the courage it took to stop pretending, to reach for what you really wanted instead of what seemed safe or expected. When Alexander stirred awake an hour later, the first thing he did was smile at Jeremy, a smile so full of joy and contentment that Jeremy felt his heart skip a beat. Good morning, Alexander said softly. Good morning, Jeremy replied. How are you feeling? Alexander considered the question seriously as he considered most things. Happy, he said finally. Cared, confused, overwhelmed, but mostly happy. Really, really happy. Jeremy kissed his forehead gently. Good. That's good. They made breakfast together, moving around Jeremy's kitchen with an ease born of years of friendship, but with new touches, new glances, new moments of casual intimacy that spoke of their changed relationship. Alexander would brush past Jeremy and let his hand linger on Jeremy's waist. Jeremy would reach around Alexander for the coffee mugs and allow himself to press close for just a moment longer than necessary. Everything was different, and nothing was different, and somehow that felt exactly right. Over breakfast, they talked about practical things, how to tell their friends and families, whether Alexander wanted to officially come out or just let people figure it out naturally, how to navigate the transition from friendship to relationship without losing the foundation that made them work so well together. Alexander had been quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, watching the cream swirl in hypnotic patterns. Jeremy, he had said finally, setting down his spoon with deliberate care. Yeah, I need you to know that this isn't just experimentation for me. This isn't me trying to figure out my sexuality by using you as a test case. I know, Jeremy had said gently, though he appreciated hearing it confirmed. No, I don't think you do, Alexander had continued, leaning forward across the small table. I need you to understand that when I say I love you, I mean I love you specifically. Not men in general, not the idea of being with a man, but you, Jeremy Ross, the person who knows how I take my coffee and remembers my mother's birthday and listens to me complain about work without trying to fix everything. The person who makes me laugh and challenges me and makes me want to be better than I am. Jeremy had felt tears prick at his eyes again, overwhelmed by the specificity of Alexander's love. Quote 123, yeah, quote one of Stum Alexander had said with characteristic honesty. Quote one them. The declaration had been so earnest, so completely Alexander, that Jeremy had gotten up from his chair and kissed him right there in the kitchen, tasting coffee and certainty and the promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. They had spent the rest of that first day together, talking and kissing and learning how to be this new version of themselves. Alexander had been eager and nervous and endearingly awkward, asking permission before every touch, apologizing for his inexperience, marveling at how different it felt to kiss someone he was actually in love with. Quote what to follow, Sarah. Alexander, if asked after a particularly intense kiss, had left them both breathless. Quote 47. Jeremy had laughed, pulling Alexander closer on the couch. Quote what doing, quote what loss, Alexander had said wonderingly. Quote to Martin, and Jeremy had been patient and gentle and overwhelmed with gratitude, hardly able to believe that this was real, that Alexander was choosing him, that they were finally allowed to love each other openly. As evening approached, they had faced their first real challenge. Alexander had looked at his phone and realized he had several missed calls from his ex-girlfriend, Sarah. Alexander had said reluctantly, Quote wangstu. Jeremy had felt a familiar stab of jealousy, but he had pushed it down. Alexander had taken Jeremy's hands in his grip firm and reassuring. Hey, he had said seriously, look at me. Whatever she wants, whatever she says, it doesn't change anything between us. You know that, right? Jeremy had nodded, though he couldn't quite suppress his anxiety. Quote 16, Alexander had said firmly. Quote 17. The conversation with Sarah had been difficult but necessary. Alexander had been honest with her about his newfound understanding of his sexuality, about his feelings for Jeremy, about the fact that their relationship had ended not because of anything she had done wrong, but because he had been trying to force himself into a life that didn't fit. Sarah had been hurt, understandably, but she had also admitted that she had sensed his emotional distance throughout their relationship. She had known on some level that his heart wasn't fully available to her. Quote him, she had said finally, and Alexander had thanked her with genuine gratitude for her grace in a difficult situation. After the call, Alexander had been quiet and thoughtful, processing the reality of what his new relationship with Jeremy meant for the rest of his life. Jeremy had asked gently, Alexander had looked at him with such love and certainty that Jeremy's remaining fears had melted away. None, my man. None, Alexander had said. Not a single one. That night, they had made the decision that Alexander would stay over, though they had agreed to take physical intimacy slowly. They had lain in Jeremy's bed, talking quietly in the darkness, Alexander's head on Jeremy's shoulder, their hands intertwined between them. Jeremy had marveled at how natural it felt, how right. He had spent so many nights imagining what it would be like to fall asleep next to Alexander, and the reality was better than anything he had dreamed. Quote 172. Alexander had whispered, quote 173. Jeremy had whispered back, quote 74. Alexander had laughed softly. Quote 25. Quote 76. They had fallen asleep to the sound of each other's breathing, and Jeremy had slept more peacefully than he had in years. The next few weeks had been a careful dance of discovery and adjustment. Alexander had thrown himself into understanding his sexuality with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. Reading articles and books, asking Jeremy thoughtful questions about his own journey of self-discovery. I feel like I'm making up for lost time, Alexander had explained one evening as he researched LGBTQ+ resources on his laptop. Like I spent so many years not understanding this part of myself, and now I want to learn everything I can. Jeremy had been patient and supportive, sharing his own experiences while being careful not to pressure Alexander into any particular identity or timeline. He had watched with love and admiration as Alexander navigated coming out to his family and friends, handling each conversation with honesty and grace. Alexander's parents had been surprised but ultimately supportive, more concerned with their son's happiness than with the gender of his partner. His mother had cried, but they were tears of relief rather than disappointment. "I've been so worried about you," she had told Alexander during their phone call. "All these years you seemed so unhappy in your relationships, so disconnected. If Jeremy makes you happy, then I'm happy for you." His friends had been largely accepting, many admitting that they had sensed something different about Alexander's previous relationships. His college roommate had laughed and said, quote 181, quote, "The transition from friendship to romantic relationship had been surprisingly smooth in most ways. They already knew each other's rhythms, already enjoyed spending time together, already had a foundation of trust and communication that many couples took years to build. But there had been challenges too. Alexander had struggled with moments of doubt, wondering if he was being fair to Jeremy by figuring out his sexuality within their relationship. He had worried about his inexperience, about whether he was good enough at being a boyfriend to a man. "What if I'm just confusing deep friendship with romantic love?" Alexander had asked one particularly difficult evening. "What if I'm not actually gay or bi, just emotionally dependent on you?" Jeremy had had his own moments of insecurity, wondering if Alexander might decide that being with a man was too difficult, too complicated, too different from what he had always imagined for his life. "What if your family never really accepts this?" Jeremy had worried aloud. "What if you start to resent me for complicating your life?" They had worked through each challenge together, talking openly about their fears and insecurities, supporting each other through the difficult moments. Their friendship had been the foundation that allowed their romantic relationship to flourish. One evening, about a month after that first kiss, they had been cooking dinner together when Alexander had suddenly stopped what he was doing and turned to Jeremy with an expression of wonder. "What?" Jeremy had asked, concerned by the intensity of Alexander's gaze. Quote 187. Alexander had said, quote, Jeremy had felt his heart swell with so much love, he thought it might overflow. Quote 189, he had said. Quote 20. Alexander had crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps and kissed Jeremy with a passion that still took Jeremy's breath away. "I am happy," Alexander had said against Jeremy's lips. Quote 192. They had made love that night for the first time, slow and careful and full of wonder. Alexander had been nervous but eager, asking questions and following Jeremy's lead with a trust that humbled Jeremy completely. "Is this okay?" Alexander had whispered as they explored each other's bodies with gentle hands and soft kisses. Quote 194, Jeremy had assured him, marveling at the beauty of Alexander's trust, his willingness to be vulnerable. Afterward, they had lain tangled together in Jeremy's bed, Alexander tracing patterns on Jeremy's chest with gentle fingers. "I can't believe I waited so long to figure this out." Alexander had said quietly. You figured it out exactly when you were supposed to, Jeremy had replied, when you were ready. Do you really believe that? Alexander had asked. I do, Jeremy had said, and he had meant it. Everything happens when it's supposed to happen. We're together now, and that's what matters. Alexander had been quiet for a long moment. Jeremy, he had said finally, yeah, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The words had been simple, without the formal structure of a proposal, but they had carried the weight of a promise that Jeremy felt in his bones. I want that too, Jeremy had said, his voice thick with emotion. I know it's too early to talk about marriage or anything like that, Alexander had continued, but I want you to know that this isn't temporary for me. This isn't a phase or an experiment. This is my life now, and I can't imagine it without you. Jeremy had turned to face Alexander fully, cupping his face in both hands. You have me, he had said seriously. For as long as you want me, you have me. Forever, Alexander had said immediately. I want you forever. They had kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promises, and Jeremy had known with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. 3 months after that pivotal movie night, Jeremy woke up in their shared apartment because Alexander had officially moved in 2 weeks earlier, to the sound of Alexander humming in the kitchen. He had lain in bed for a moment, listening to the domestic sounds of the man he loved making coffee and probably burning toast, and marveled at how perfectly ordinary and extraordinary his life had become. The apartment was filled with evidence of their merged lives. Alexander's books mixed with Jeremy's on the shelves, their photos together displayed on the mantel, Alexander's terrible abstract art prints somehow harmonizing with Jeremy's vintage movie posters. It was a visual representation of how seamlessly their lives had woven together. When he had finally gotten up and wandered into the kitchen, he had found Alexander standing at the stove in one of Jeremy's old college t-shirts, his hair sticking up at odd angles, stirring scrambled eggs with intense concentration. Quote 211. Jeremy had said, wrapping his arms around Alexander from behind and pressing a kiss to his neck. Alexander had melted back against Jeremy's chest with a contentment that still amazed Jeremy every morning. Good morning, Alexander had murmured. I'm making breakfast. I can see that, Jeremy had said with amusement, noting the slightly blackened toast on the counter. How are the eggs? Not burned, Alexander had said proudly. I'm getting better at this domestic stuff. Jeremy had laughed, spinning Alexander around in his arms to face him. You're perfect at this domestic stuff, he had said, kissing Alexander's forehead. Quote 219. Alexander had smiled, the bright, unguarded smile that Jeremy had fallen in love with. Quote 220, he had said, as he said every morning, as if the words were new and miraculous every time. Quote 20, Jeremy had replied, as he replied every morning, meaning it more each day. They had eaten breakfast together at their kitchen table, Alexander's feet tangled with Jeremy's under the table, talking about their plans for the day. Alexander had a work presentation that afternoon that he was nervous about. Jeremy had a deadline for a project that was stressing him out. Normal couple things, everyday concerns that felt extraordinary simply because they were sharing them. After breakfast, as they had gotten ready for work, Alexander had caught Jeremy's eye in the bathroom mirror while they brushed their teeth side by side. Jeremy, Alexander had said, his mouth still full of toothpaste. Jeremy had raised an eyebrow in question. Alexander had spit out his toothpaste and rinsed his mouth before turning to face Jeremy directly. Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't leaned on your shoulder that night? Jeremy had considered the question as he finished brushing his own teeth. I think you would have figured it out eventually, he had said finally. Maybe not that night, maybe not with me, but you would have figured out that you weren't happy pretending to be someone you weren't. But would we have figured it out together? Alexander had asked. Jeremy had pulled Alexander into his arms, holding him close in their small bathroom. I'd like to think so, he had said. I'd like to think that love like this finds a way. Alexander had held him tighter. I'm glad we didn't have to find out, he had said. I'm glad it was that night, on your couch, with you. Me too, Jeremy had agreed. They had stood there for a moment, holding each other in the morning light streaming through their bathroom window, marveling at the simple miracle of being together. I have to go to work, Alexander had said eventually. though he made no move to pull away. "I know," Jeremy had said. "Me too." But neither of them had moved, content to steal a few more minutes of closeness before facing the day apart. Finally, Alexander had pulled back enough to look into Jeremy's eyes. "Oh, change your eyes," he had said, Jeremy had said, with a smile. Quote 238. Alexander had agreed. Quote 239. Jeremy had laughed, kissing Alexander one more time before they had finally, reluctantly, separated to finish getting ready for work. That evening, they had done exactly what Alexander had suggested. They had ordered pizza from their favorite place, the same place they had ordered from countless times when they were just friends. They had settled onto their couch, the same couch where everything had changed, and had queued up a ridiculously bad romantic comedy. But this time, instead of sitting at opposite ends and gradually moving closer, they had started cuddled together. Alexander had his head on Jeremy's shoulder from the beginning, Jeremy's arms wrapped around him. Their legs tangled together under a soft blanket that Alexander had brought from his old apartment. Alexander had said during a particularly cheesy scene where the female lead declared her love through interpretive dance. Quote 241, Jeremy had asked. Quote Ton, quote Dorsten, Alexander had said, snuggling closer. Quote Tornon, they had watched the entire movie like that, making jokes about the terrible dialogue and predictable plot, but mostly just enjoying the simple pleasure of being close to each other. Jeremy had marveled at how natural it felt, how right to have Alexander in his arms like this without having to pretend it was just friendship. When the credits had rolled, neither of them had moved to turn off the television or suggest going to bed. They had just stayed there, holding each other in the flickering light of the screen, content to exist in this perfect moment. Quote 245. Alexander had said eventually, his voice soft in the darkness. Alexander had said, lifting his head to look at Jeremy. And Jeremy had asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. Alexander had said simply. Jeremy had felt his eyes fill with tears of joy. He had said. And Alexander had smiled, that beautiful, unguarded smile that Jeremy would never get tired of seeing. Quote 256, he had said. Quote 257, Jeremy had agreed, pulling Alexander closer. Quote to FM, they had fallen asleep like that, just as they had that first night, wrapped around each other on their couch. But this time, when Jeremy had woken in the early hours of the morning, he hadn't marveled at the surprise of finding Alexander still in his arms. This time, he had simply felt the deep contentment of knowing that Alexander would be there when he woke up tomorrow, and the day after that, and for all the days to come. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Jeremy had thought as he watched Alexander sleep peacefully in his arms. Sometimes the love you're looking for is right there beside you, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach for it. Alexander had stirred slightly in his sleep, unconsciously moving closer to Jeremy's warmth, and Jeremy had pressed a soft kiss to the top of his head. Sometimes Jeremy had thought with a smile, all it takes is the courage to stay exactly where you are and see what happens when you stop pretending that friendship is enough. Outside their window, the world continued its ancient dance of night turning to day. But inside their small apartment, wrapped in each other's arms on the couch where everything had changed, Jeremy and Alexander had found something that would last far beyond the changing of any season. They had found each other, finally and completely, and they were home.